Not one tear, not one.
Stella said it to the mirror, then again, 4 times, like a rule that needed repeating before it could become true. Her eyes were red at the rims. Dry, though. She'd promised herself that much. The jade silk dress was the only one in her closet that didn't carry a memory of being laughed at. She'd checked twice before packing it. Downstairs in the grand ballroom at the plaza, 200 people were already drinking champagne under crystal chandeliers, celebrating an engagement that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the man who had once promised her a different kind of forever. One more pass of concealer over 3 sleepless nights of bar exam prep. One evening, she told herself. Then she'd never have to see any of them again. She was wrong. She had no idea how wrong. The ballroom smelled like money and orchids. String music drifted over the clink of glasses. Stella walked in on the red carpet runner, chin level, spine straight, the way she'd practiced in the mirror an hour earlier. She found Ryan Mitchell's face first. He stood near the tall windows overlooking Central Park, one arm looped around Caroline Foster's waist. Blood-red gown, diamonds at her throat, platinum hair falling straight to her hips. They were laughing with a cluster of well-dressed strangers, the kind of laugh that only exists to be overheard. Beside her, Leah went stiff. Her cousin had been engaged 6 months now to a man whose family did business with the Fosters, quiet real estate deals, the kind that ran through the same law firms and the same country clubs. Stella hadn't thought much of it. Until tonight. She was starting to. Ryan saw her. His familiar half-smile spread across his face. Stella God, still that same shape. His voice pitched up just enough for the nearby tables to catch every word. I figured after 3 years you'd have done something about it. Still the receptionist at the law firm adorable, like a little decoration. Caroline giggled, her eyes tracking slowly down Stella's body, chest, waist, hips, calves, like she was appraising livestock at auction.
Just smile,
Leah whispered, gripping her hand under the table. Her voice shook worse than Stella's hand did. Stella smiled. It cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. For one frozen second, being looked at like merchandise dragged her straight back 3 years to a version of herself who used to go to bed hungry more nights than she'd admit, chasing the small, cruel currency of Ryan's approval. She had never told anyone how much of herself she'd tried to erase for him, not even Leah. Her phone lit up inside her clutch. A message from a mutual friend had resurfaced at the top of her lock screen. Ryan asked me for old photos of you 2 months ago. Said it was to prepare for the engagement party. Be careful. Stella went very still. None of it had been spontaneous. Every cruel word tonight had been planned in advance, rehearsed, staged, timed to land in front of an audience she hadn't known she'd been cast for. Shame flooded her, hot and immediate. Then something colder, betrayal, arriving 3 years too late to do anything but burn. Her fingers tightened around the champagne flute until her knuckles went white. For half a second, her face was pure and open eyes, wide lips trembling before she forced her mouth into a thin, brittle smile. Ryan misread the silence as defeat. He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, and lifted his glass toward the next round of the evening. He had no idea the round was about to change entirely. Stella set her glass down slowly. Her hand was steadier than her heart. Near the tall double doors, a heavy-set older man in a charcoal suit glanced at her, then quickly looked away. She half recognized him, a name from her firm's shipping client files, someone connected to Foster Shipping, the company that quietly ran half the cargo through Red Hook. She filed the thought away without knowing yet why it would matter. The night had barely started, and somewhere just outside those double doors, a car was already pulling up to the curb, one that would change everything before dessert was even served. Ryan wasn't finished. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and started in on old times. His voice dipped in fake sympathy, pitched exactly loud enough for the next table to catch it. He brought up the time she'd cried because a sample wedding dress in a smaller size didn't fit. He brought up the interview she'd lost because, in his words, the company image needed something slimmer. He finished with a line that landed like a slap. The bar exam. Her. I figured she'd still be fetching coffee for some partner. Caroline laughed softly after every line, a little, "Oh God," tossed in for effect. A few relatives chuckled along, uncomfortable but silent. Nobody defended her. Stella sat very still, remembering something none of them knew. She had quietly paid off 18 months of joint debt the two of them had signed together, working night shifts at the law library, sleeping 4 hours a night, never telling her own family a word of it. Silence had become survival. It was the only language she trusted anymore. The shame in her chest curdled slowly into rage. Rage she had no outlet for. Rage that sat in her throat like a stone. She stared down at her heels, at the ache already climbing her calves, and said nothing. The same heavy-set man from earlier, Foster Shipping, stitched discreetly onto his lapel pin, glanced her way again, then turned deliberately back to his own conversation, unwilling to get involved. The room's silence wasn't neutral. It was complicity. And complicity, multiplied by 200 witnesses, turned one man's cruelty into a public execution. Stella finally stood. "Excuse me," she said, barely above a whisper, her voice nearly cracking on the second word. She walked toward the ladies' room with her head down, her heels unsteady on the marble. That was when the ballroom doors opened. A man stepped through them, like the room had been built around the space he was about to occupy. 6'3", a black tailored suit with no tie, dark hair combed back and precise, the kind of quiet, dangerous stillness that had made men twice his age step aside without being asked. Nobody in that ballroom needed an introduction to know exactly what kind of power had just walked in. This was a Mafia boss, and everyone in the room seemed to sense it in their spine before their mind caught up. His ice-blue eyes swept the room once and stopped exactly where Stella's empty chair sat. He had caught the tail end of what Ryan said. All of it apparently mattered to him more than anyone at that table could have guessed. Near the door, a man later revealed as Grant's associate gave him the smallest nod, as though he'd been expecting this moment all along. Grant Hamilton started walking toward the table. His steps were slow, deliberate, and the entire ballroom seemed to lean toward him without meaning to. Somewhere behind him, Stella was just stepping back out of the hallway, smoothing her dress, bracing herself to sit back down and finish the night with her chin up. She had no idea the next 30 seconds would be the ones this entire city would still be talking about a week later. Ryan spent 3 years making Stella feel small, and nobody at that table said a word to stop him. Who do you blame more? Ryan for the cruelty, or everyone else at the table who stayed silent and let it happen? Comment Ryan or the table below. Let's settle this. Grant reached the table a full step ahead of her, close enough that when Stella returned, she nearly walked straight into him. The air around the table changed before he even spoke. Someone's fork clinked against a plate and stopped mid-motion. The string quartet in the corner faltered for half a bar, the cellist's bow catching on the wrong note before recovering. Stella would remember that detail later, the tiny human stumble in the music, as if even the room's rehearsed elegance couldn't hold its composure around him. He didn't wait for an introduction. Every conversation around the table dropped into silence the way a room goes quiet before a storm rolls over open water. Not fear exactly, but the animal instinct to stop moving until you know which way it's headed. He came to stand just behind her, one large warm hand resting against the bare skin at the low back of her dress, exactly where the silk cut away. His palm was warm against skin gone cold from 3 years of practiced numbness. She felt the calluses at the base of his fingers, not the hands of a man who signed papers behind a desk his whole life. "Sorry I'm late, Piccolina," he said, his voice low but carrying, meant for the whole table to hear. Stella's breath caught. Before she could fully turn, he leaned down. It was not the kiss of a stranger claiming a stranger. It was slow, deliberate, unmistakably possessive. And for one suspended second, Stella felt her own hands rise, not to push him away, but to steady herself against the lapel of his jacket. Up close, he smelled like cedar, and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a car that had been running too long in cold weather. She hadn't decided to let it happen. She simply hadn't decided to stop it either. And in that half-second of choosing, something in her that had spent 3 years shrinking chose instead to stay exactly where she was. Somewhere behind them, a champagne glass tipped and shattered against the marble. Nobody moved to clean it. 200 people had gone completely unnaturally still, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the eardrums. For Grant, the kiss was never about spectacle. It was the only language he trusted for something he couldn't yet say out loud. A man who had spent a decade building an empire by controlling every variable had just done something reckless and unplanned, driven less by desire for ownership than by an old, unhealed grief he saw mirrored in her humiliation. For Stella, choosing not to pull away was the first decision she had made in years that wasn't shaped around someone else's comfort. A small, private rebellion against a lifetime of making herself smaller to be tolerated. Camera still, the entire grand ballroom seemed to hold its breath around them. When he finally pulled back, he looked directly at Ryan, his eyes flat and cold. Up close, Stella noticed the muscle working at his jaw, a tightness that hadn't been there when he walked through the doors, as if the calm on his face was costing him something to maintain. "This is my woman," he said. "The next person who opens their mouth to insult her will explain to the entire New York shipping industry why their cargo suddenly can't clear a single port for another week." The reaction rippled outward instantly. The Foster shipping executive stood, immediately gave the Mafia boss a small deferential nod, and left the table without a word, his chair scraping loud against the marble in the silence. The sound absurdly large, a detail Stella noticed, but didn't yet understand. Caroline went pale, her contempt curdling into visible fear the moment she recognized the heirloom watch on Grant's wrist, her fingers tightening around her own champagne flute until the stem trembled. Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hand, still resting on the back of Caroline's chair, had gone rigid, knuckles white against the velvet upholstery. As Grant led Stella away from the table, his associate near the door leaned toward another man, his voice pitched just loud enough for Stella to catch in passing. "That's the paralegal who flagged the East River permit filing last year, the one nobody could buy off." Grant's body went rigid for half a second, so brief that if Stella hadn't been standing against his side feeling the shift through his arm, she might have missed it entirely. His eyes cut toward her, something deeper and more complicated passing behind them. Recognition, maybe? Or the particular unease of a man realizing a stranger has already mattered to him longer than he's willing to admit. Stella's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, a rushing static that drowned out the murmurs starting up behind them like a held breath finally released. For the first time in years, someone had stood beside her in public without asking her to make herself smaller first. Grant guided her toward the exit, his hands still resting at her waist like a living shield. The entire ballroom watched them go in complete silence, broken only by the quiet, mortified scrape of someone finally sweeping up the broken glass. Outside on Fifth Avenue, the night air was cold, sharp enough that Stella felt it in her teeth after the hothouse warmth of the ballroom. Traffic hissed past on wet asphalt. Somewhere a cab driver leaned on his horn. Stella finally exhaled the breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 years and watched it turn to fog in front of her. She looked up at him. "Who are you?" Grant didn't answer right away. For a moment, he studied her face in the streetlight, as if deciding how much of the truth she could carry tonight on top of everything else. He opened the door of a black Mercedes and said only, "Get in. We'll talk where it's safer." She hesitated for exactly 1 second, long enough to feel the old instinct rear up, the one that had learned to distrust anyone who spoke to her with that much certainty. Then she got in anyway. Something about the way he'd said safer and not better or nicer told her he understood exactly what kind of night this had been. The Mercedes cut through the city fast, the lights of Fifth Avenue smearing gold across the windows. Stella sat with her hands pressed together over her lap, her pulse still uneven from the kiss that had just rewritten her entire evening in front of 200 strangers. Beside her sat a man the tabloids would soon be calling New York's most private mafia boss. Silent, his jaw tight in a way that told her the calm from the ballroom had cost him something. Neither of them spoke for several blocks. The privacy glass hummed faintly as it rose between them and the driver. Outside the city blurred past a bodega's neon sign, a couple arguing under an awning. The ordinary world going on as if nothing had just happened. Stella found herself gripping the edge of the leather seat, grounding herself in something solid. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said, her voice smaller than she meant it to be.
I know. He didn't elaborate. His eyes stayed on the passing streets, and for a moment, she saw something pass over his face. Not regret exactly, but the particular stillness of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already settled. The elevator opened into a penthouse at 432 Park Avenue, floor-to-ceiling glass walls looking straight down over a darkened Central Park. The city lights below glittered like something watching them back. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No clutter, no photographs, nothing that suggested a life lived comfortably here. It struck Stella as a place built for control, not for comfort. And she wondered briefly what kind of man needed that much emptiness around him. Grant shrugged off his jacket, the edge of his chest tattoo visible beneath his open collar. Dark ink, old enough that its lines had softened at the edges, though she couldn't make out the shape from where she stood. He poured himself a drink and handed Stella a glass of water instead. The gesture was small, but it landed. Nobody in 3 years had thought to ask what she actually needed instead of what looked good beside her. She sat down on the leather sofa, her voice hoarse but steady. "I used to think if I got quieter, smaller, gave up enough of myself, everything would finally be fine. Tonight is the first night in 3 years I didn't want to disappear." Grant listened without interrupting, his expression darkening at something in the way she said it. Not the words themselves, but everything they weren't saying. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment, the only sound was the faint tick of the building settling and the distant, muffled wash of traffic 30 floors below. "You said his name like it still costs you something," he said quietly. "It shouldn't anymore." She almost laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Tell that to 3 years of it." He didn't answer that. Instead, he studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, the way a man studies a ledger he already knows doesn't balance, looking for the one number that will explain the whole mess. He stepped out onto the balcony to take a call. Through the glass, Stella watched his silhouette against the skyline, one hand braced on the railing, his shoulders set in a way that told her the call wasn't good news, even before his voice sharpened. She caught only fragments through the glass tonight. "Now don't wait," before he lowered his voice further. In that moment, Stella's phone lit up, an automated email from the bar examiner's office. Your application has been placed on hold pending verification of employment history following a formal complaint filed through outside counsel. The attached letterhead bore the name of a compliance office tied to the foster family's holdings. Her face went white. Her hand trembled so badly the phone nearly slipped from her fingers. Tonight's humiliation had only been the surface. They were moving to erase her future. In the same evening, they'd humiliated her in public. Fear replaced shock, cold and absolute. She wasn't just the target of cruel words anymore. She was the target of a deliberate campaign. She thought absurdly of the 3 years she'd spent studying at the law library after closing the security guard who used to leave the back door unlocked for her. The 18 months of debt she'd paid off in silence. All of it, quietly, systematically, at risk of being unmade by people who had never once had to work for anything they held. Grant's phone flashed red. He listened, his jaw tightening, then turned to her, his voice flat. 3 men just broke into your apartment on the Lower East Side. They weren't there to take anything. They were sent to scare you. Stella shot to her feet, the water glass forgotten on the coffee table, her pulse loud in her ears again. But different now, sharper, an animal alertness instead of humiliation. For the first time, real fear showed on her face. Not fear of being mocked, but fear of what waited for her outside this building. Grant made one short call. His voice, when he spoke, had none of the smooth menace from the ballroom. It was quiet, precise, almost bored. The voice of a man giving an order he expects to be obeyed without discussion. Get them off her block. Make sure they don't come back. Minutes later, word came back. The car outside her building had been found abandoned 3 streets away. The men already gone. Stella turned toward the glass wall, watching her own reflection with Grant's silhouette standing behind her like a wall of protection. Below them, the park was a dark, unreadable shape between the lit grid of streets, and she found herself thinking that somewhere down there was her apartment, her books, the modest life she'd built out of nothing, suddenly fragile in a way it had never felt before. He turned back to her, his eyes steady. "You're not the hunted one anymore," he said. "You're the protected one. But protection isn't enough. I need to know what you actually want." She didn't answer right away. The question sat between them, heavier than it should have been for 4 words, and for the first time all night, Stella realized nobody had asked her that. Not tonight, not in 3 years, maybe not ever. Morning came in pale silver light through the penthouse glass. Stella woke in the guest room to find a new dress laid out on the chair, dark-fitted cut to flatter every curve she had, and a note in sharp handwriting. "You can leave any time, or stay for breakfast. There's no wrong choice." She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment before reaching for it, turning the note over once, as if checking for a second meaning, some catch she'd missed. There wasn't one. That, more than anything he'd said the night before, unsettled her. The plainness of it, the absence of any leverage tucked inside, the kindness. She stayed. They sat across from each other at the table, Central Park spread out below them, the air different from the night before, quieter but tighter with something unspoken. A pot of coffee sat between them, untouched at first. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor as the morning wore on, and somewhere below, faint and distant, the ordinary sounds of the city waking up drifted up through the glass. A garbage truck, a dog barking, someone's car alarm chirping off. Grant set his coffee down. The cup made a small, precise sound against the saucer, and Stella noticed his hand wasn't quite steady around it. The first unguarded thing she'd seen from him since the ballroom. "I knew about you before last night," he said. "Not by chance. My sister died 6 months ago." He said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, the way a man states a fact he's had to repeat to himself so many times it no longer bruises on the way out. though something in his eyes suggested that wasn't quite true yet either. Before that, she'd spent years being dismissed by people exactly like the ones in that ballroom. The same circles, the same casual cruelty. After she was gone, I had people track anyone Ryan Mitchell had humiliated in public the way she'd been humiliated. Your name came up first. I didn't just protect you last night. I'd been watching for you for months. Stella studied him for a long moment, seeing for the first time the loneliness underneath the ice in his eyes. It reframed the whole night, not a stranger's reckless impulse, but the culmination of something he'd been carrying quietly for half a year, waiting for a moment he could finally do something with it. She thought of her own silence, the debts she'd paid without telling anyone, and recognized uneasily a version of the same instinct in him. Grief turned into a task because a task could be managed, and grief could not. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your sister." He nodded, once a small, contained motion, and didn't say anything else about it. Some things, she was learning, he only let out part way before folding them back down. Her phone rang, Leah crying. "I'm so sorry. My fiancé's family does business with the Fosters. They asked me to make sure Ryan and Caroline were seated near you tonight. They wanted to see how far they could push before someone stepped in. I didn't know it would go this far. I turned you into bait without meaning to." Stella listened in silence, the phone pressed hard against her ear, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Grant's shoulder, on the pale morning haze over the park. She thought of Leah's hand, gripping hers under the table the night before, the whispered, "Just smile," and understood now that it hadn't been comfort. It had been guilt dressed up as comfort, because Leah had known all along what that seating chart meant. Leah's confession wasn't the cruelty of an enemy. It was the smaller, more familiar failure of someone caught between loving her cousin and fearing what her new family could take from her if she refused them. She had chosen comfort over courage, telling herself it was a small thing, a seating chart, nothing more, because admitting otherwise would have meant risking everything she'd built her future on. Stella's silence in that moment wasn't forgiveness, yet it was the quiet, weary recognition that people who are afraid will often protect their own safety before they protect you, and that this, too, was something she no longer had the energy to be shattered by. The betrayal from the one relative who had ever stood beside her made her shoulders tremble, but her eyes stayed dry. She thought of all the family dinners where Leah had been the only one to ask how bar exam prep was going, the only one who remembered her birthday without being reminded, and how none of that erased what she'd just admitted, and none of it was erased by it either. Both things were simply true now, sitting side by side, the way most betrayals by people you love actually work. She set the phone down, looked at Grant, and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "I don't need anyone to save me from my past anymore. I just need someone who doesn't ask me to shrink to fit inside their frame." Grant didn't offer empty comfort. He simply gave one small nod, accepting the terms, the same economy of gesture she was starting to recognize as the closest thing he had to a promise. A message lit up his phone from an associate. Ryan Mitchell had been advised to leave New York within 48 hours. If he stayed, every contract tied to his fiancé's family would be frozen. Stella stood, picked up the new dress, and said, "I'll stay, not because I'm afraid, because I want to see what you do next." Grant watched her walk away, his expression more complicated than she had ever seen it, something between relief and a kind of wariness, as if he understood exactly how much he'd just agreed to, and wasn't entirely sure he deserved it. 3 days later, at her law office on West Street, a bouquet of pure white flowers sat on Stella's desk beside a card with a single line. "Still waiting for your answer, Piccolina. G." She held the card, and for the first time in a long while, the dimple in her left cheek appeared without effort, without a shred of pretending. Around her, the office carried on in its usual rhythm, phones ringing, the copier humming down the hall, a paralegal 2 desks over complaining about a filing deadline, and for the first time in years, the noise of an ordinary day felt like something she was allowed to be part of, not something she had to earn her place inside. She'd gone back to her apartment the day before, just once, to collect a few things. The building super had shrugged when she asked about the break-in. "Nothing on the cameras, ma'am. Real strange." And she'd stood in her small kitchen for a long moment, looking at the deadbolt Grant's people had quietly reinforced overnight without asking her permission first. She'd meant to be annoyed by the presumption. She found she wasn't. That afternoon, Grant showed up exactly when she got off work. No bodyguards. Alone. He asked to walk with her along Hudson River Park. They walked side by side under the late sun, the light coming in low and orange off the water, throwing long shadows across the promenade. Joggers passed them. A cyclist rang a bell somewhere behind, and for a stretch of several blocks neither of them said anything at all. A silence that had none of the tension of the ballroom in it. Only the easy, unhurried kind 2 people fall into when they've stopped performing for each other. The wind lifted the edge of her dress. His tattoo showed clearly as he rolled up his sleeve. She could see it properly now in daylight. A compass rose worked into darker geometric lines. Old ink gone slightly blue-green at the edges. She didn't ask what it meant. Some things she was learning to understand about him. You waited for him to offer. Near Pier 45, Ryan Mitchell and Caroline Foster appeared without warning, flanked by 2 lawyers and a thick envelope. Caroline smiled, cold as glass. "Grant, you have exactly 2 choices. Sign papers renouncing any connection to this little receptionist in front of the press waiting at the end of the pier, or the Brooklyn port contract you've spent 14 months negotiating disappears within the hour. My father's company controls half the terminal space you need. He's already made the call." It was a direct hit, the same Foster shipping name that had shadowed the whole story, now revealing exactly how much power it held. Behind Caroline, Ryan said nothing. His eyes fixed somewhere over Grant's shoulder, unable to hold anyone's gaze directly. The same posture Stella noted distantly that she used to catch in her own mirror 3 years ago. The silence stretched unbearably. A gull cried somewhere over the water. Stella stood beside him, saying nothing, only watching her hands loosely at her sides. Instead of clenched, she noticed that about herself. The absence of the old bracing. Grant lifted his phone, put it on speaker, and called his partner in Japan directly. "Cancel the Brooklyn contract, now. I'm choosing my woman." His voice didn't shake, didn't hesitate. On the other end, a pause, then a single word of confirmation, and it was done. 14 months of leverage dissolved in under 10 seconds. For a man who had spent his entire adult life measuring worth in leverage contracts and control, giving up the deal wasn't recklessness. It was the first time he'd ever chosen something he couldn't calculate a return on. The Mafia boss, who had built an empire out of never losing, had just discovered that some things only become valuable the moment you're willing to lose everything else for them. It cost him a piece of the legacy he'd spent a decade building, but it was the first decision in years that felt entirely, unmistakably, his own. Caroline's composure cracked first her mouth, opening on some retort that never came. Ryan finally looked up, and for a moment his face held something almost like the old ballroom performance, ready to salvage the scene with a laugh. But there was no audience left to perform for out here. Just the river and the gulls, and 2 people who no longer needed his approval to know what they were worth. After he hung up, he turned the screen toward her, showing a message from his lawyer. Only one person left who understands the clean legal path to save what's left of the deal. The same paralegal who flagged the East River file last year.
He said quiet, almost only for her. "I don't just need to protect you. I need you to help me build something clean enough to survive this. And I'm willing to lose everything for the chance." Stella looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward, took hold of his lapel, right where the edge of his tattoo showed beneath his collar, and kissed him first. Fully, completely, in broad daylight, in front of the very people who had once tried to erase her. They stood there as the city lights began to rise over the Hudson. Stella was no longer the woman people mocked behind cupped hands. Grant was no longer a mafia boss standing alone at the top of an empire. And for the first time, both of them felt like enough. This story reminds us that dignity was never something other people could hand out or take away. It was something Stella had been carrying the whole time, even when nobody around her could see it. If you've spent years feeling overlooked at a family table or invisible in a room that used to feel like yours, here's something worth trying this week. The next time someone brings up an old embarrassment to get a laugh, don't argue and don't shrink. Just say, "That was a long time ago," and change the subject yourself. You take the room back in one sentence. If you're recently widowed or living alone after retirement, consider this. Loneliness gets quieter when you give it a weekly appointment, a Tuesday coffee with a neighbor, a Thursday call with your sister, something on the calendar that isn't optional. And if someone in your life keeps joking about your weight, your age, or your slower pace since you retired, you're allowed to say plainly, "I don't find that funny," without softening it into a laugh first. You don't need an empire or a mafia boss standing behind you to be treated with respect. You only ever needed to stop asking for permission to expect it. If Stella's transformation moved you tonight, tell us where you'd draw your own line. Comment Team Stella if you'd have done exactly what she did. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more stories of quiet women finally being seen.